Hello and welcome to English Literature with Susan. Today I want to talk about the Romantic period based on the introduction of the Norton Anthology of English Literature. Let's check these dates and the prominence of the Romantic period. In the Norton Anthology of English Literature, it is written that the Romantic period is thus far the shortest but the most influential period in English literature. Its being short is quite obvious from these dates, but why the most influential? To know this, we should refer back to Terry Eagleton, who says, "Today we are all card carrying romantics," meaning that we take our definition, understanding, and conception of the notion of literature from Romanticism. And what is the denominator here? What is the criterion based on which we share the understanding of poetry or literature with the Romantics is the term imagination. Before the Romantic period, the term imagination didn't exist as it is today. Today, we more or less consciously or unconsciously refer to any literary work as an imaginative work. So, literary writing is also imaginative, or in our categorization and classification of the mind, we think of literature as imaginative. Imaginative or imagination was the key term in Romanticism, and for the first time, the Romantics considered imagination as the key and the basis of the production of a poem or a literary work. So, because of this, Romantic period is considered to be the most influential, at least to what we know of literature today. And about these days, 1785 is sometimes considered as an alternative date for the beginning of Romanticism. Why 1785? Because it marks the year in which William Cooper's The Task was published, and The Task was in a kind of sharp contradiction with what was preceding it. In 1784, Samuel Johnson died. Samuel Johnson was the last eminent neoclassical figure. Samuel Johnson, the writer of the dictionary, which is considered to be the first dictionary written in English, as a neoclassical figure who believed in generalizations, who believed in rationality and human reason as a universal phenomena, shared these things with people uh, previous to him, like Alexander Pope or Jonathan Swift. But when in 1784 Dr. Johnson died, nobody ever shared such ideas. So new ideas were introduced, and we enter into a transitory period. This transitory period is sometimes called the Age of Sensibility, and it is kind of William Cooper's The Task is considered to be the pioneer work in this period. So writers' emotions are now better expressed in their works. Works are more private and personal than the previous era, in which the social understanding was a close particle of literature, and literature introduces the private ideas or the emotional state of the mind of the poets into them. So some consider 1784 or 1785 as the beginning of the Age of Sensibility, and some even consider this transitory period as a part of the real Romanticism. However, there are other alternative dates for the Romantic period. Some believe that the Romantic period had started in 1789, which marks the year of the French Revolution. They say that the high hopes, the changes the French Revolution brought all across Europe and the world can also be the reason that Romanticism started. And they are not more or less wrong, because Romanticism is also has a spirit of rebelliousness, which is shared with that rebellious ideas, with those rebellious ideas predominant at the time of the French Revolution in France and in some other parts of the world. So radicalism was at the core, and also we have a person who interconnects Romanticism and the French Revolution, and that person, that figure, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is the one who had written that the individual actually is more important than the society or the monarch. Each individual has an idea, so the individuals have the right to decide for their own future or for their own governmental system. Rousseau also was a critic of the educational system in France and Europe, and he thought that the nature is the central aspect of human living, and he believed that nature is the best teacher, and he brought forth the notion of the noble savage and things like that. So some believe that Rousseau is not only the father of the French Revolution because of his emphasis on individualism and his criticism of different dominant systems in France, but also by using key terms such as nature, such as individual, and such as personal rights and noble savage. He is also interconnected with the romantic movement. So because of these things, some believe that the real romantic period had started with that spirit of rebelliousness associated with the French Revolution, and therefore the starting point is considered to be 1789. And this is also important to know that the French Revolution was kind of related to German Romanticism. We can say that historically speaking, the Romantic movement as a literary school had started in Germany by such figures such as Goethe. Goethe lived in a part of Germany, in Frankfurt actually, from where he could easily travel to France and come back. And Goethe and the group of his like-minded were influenced by the French Revolution, and they were also against the literary old regime and literary conventions. They started a movement called Sturm und Stress, Sturm und Drang in German, and which they tried to react to the literary forefathers, especially the classical types of literature, which limited and bounded imagination and emphasized imitating the previous eras or classical writers' works. So, in this way, also French Revolution can be considered as a convenient date for the beginning of Romanticism, and there are other starting dates as well. For example, we have 1798, which is the year in which the lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge was published anonymously. They say that by the publication of this work, they have changed the whole course of literature, because we are going back to lyrical literature, which was almost forgotten by the new classical writers and poets. And also, we have a turn back to the private or personal aspects or subjective aspects of literature, therefore, the title lyrical. After 2 years to reactions actually to their work, William Wordsworth finally wrote a preface to the lyrical ballads and published it at 1800. And therefore, some people consider 1800 as a round number for starting point of the Romanticism, in which the manifesto, the so-called manifesto of the Romantic period, was published by William Wordsworth as a preface to that already published book, Lyrical Ballads. 1830, we can say 1830s in general is considered as the ending of Romanticism. For example, at 1832, Sir Walter Scott, a prominent Romantic novelist, was dead, or the first Reform Bill uh, uh, was considered and observed by the government in England. So they say that 1830s in general is the ending point of Romanticism. And finally, Queen Victoria took power in England, and the Victorian era had started. By 1830, almost every romantic figure was dead. The only one among the poets, the only one who was living was William Wordsworth, but William Wordsworth was not that much productive at the time. So this information was about the date. And let's go to the context. It's a time of revolution and reaction. So, if we consider the historical context, not only the French Revolution, to which we will later on return, but also the Industrial Revolution was very important factor in the emergence to life of the Romantic period. England is supposed to be, or considered to be by the historians, to be the first country which moved from agricultural or a feudal form of society into an industrial nation. And this was not an easy transition for the English people. Anyway, any revolutions, any big changes are difficult to be held by people. And it was also difficult for the English people to keep with the pace of these rapid changes happening. And the social system was changing. The relationship of the human beings was changing. The hierarchical relationship between a landowner and a person who was working on the land was changing until the emergence of the factories, and the people are now the workers of those factories, having wages and things like that. And One of the results of this changing from agricultural society or an agrarian one to an industrial one was the overpopulation of the cities. And moreover, we have air pollution, for example, or we have child work. All of them were included. And the Romantics, most of the times, considered the ruining of nature as the most, let's say, dangerous aspect of this industrialization of the nation, because factories or the cities were expanding, and the natural scenery was being more and more affected, and losing its type of virginity it had, or wilderness it had, by the time of the Industrial Revolution. So this change was not easy to follow for the English people. For example, there were some rules observed in the Parliament, and Lord Byron reacted to them. That they just wanted to consider some severe punishment for the people who intruded in the works of the because people previously were doing works by hand and individually, but now it was a group work, and it was a factory, and it had a boss. And people didn't get what they wanted. They were no more independent. And, in the parliament, the members wanted to consider sometimes the punishment of execution for these people who kind of impeded the working of these factories. And Lord Byron, for example, reacted. By the way, industrialization was something its progress, and they could not stop it. But at least in their poetry, the Romantics could react and could show their objection to this rapid change. And another revolutionary context is, of course, the context of the French Revolution. I'm not going to dwell too much in this, but just as a kind of pre-information for you to know, the French Revolution happened when the three social systems, or the three classifications of the society, were not in balance. In the old regime of France, it is called old regime. In the old regime, there were three dominant groups, or three categories for the people of the country. The first category, or the first state, was related to the clergy class. So the bishops and anyone in the clerical order was part of the first state. So they were the first ranks of the society. The second rank included the nobility, from the royals to the landowners, and the third state, included any types of the people. So ordinary people, the bankers, the bourgeois in general, the people who were active in market, the businessmen, all of them were part of the third state. The problem was that at that time, many parts of the lands was occupied by the church. So they say that the Church of France was the greatest landowner at the time. And the other problem was the war costs, and the costs and the debts of the government. The government was at debt because keeping an army in balance and in kind of a prepared state is not easy, especially that France was involved in the American Revolution and American War for Independence. The government was forced to impose more taxes on the people, and the people tried to react to that. Finally, the second state, or the nobility, tried to change things by gathering into the National Assembly, and the nobility, or the second state, was broken into the king or the royal family and the others, and they stood against the king. So at first it was like that, but what happened was not maybe uh, to the control of this nobility, was the including of the lower classes, or the working classes, also into this revolution, or into this state of change. because in 1788 they had a bad harvest. The farmers were not satisfied with the condition, and when the things was not that much in order in Paris, they started to move from their countrysides to Paris, and everything was out of control all of a sudden. And the siege of Bastille happened, and finally the French Revolution was successful. General Lafayette also introduced the three colors of the revolution. Red and blue were already the colors of the city Paris, and the color white was the color of the Bourbon family, and which was one of the noble families, or one of the nobility in France. And in this way, the people and the nobility, or the third state and the second state, were now interconnected, and the colors of the revolution were introduced. By the way, just let me tell you that many of the members of the bourgeois were not at first in agreement with this revolution, because they had money, and unlike the landowners whose property was safe, their property was not safe. If a war happened, if a revolution happened, they would actually lose some benefits. So they stood beside the king, but at the end of the day, the revolution happened. The revolution happened, but maybe it was not that much of a success, because in 1792 the reign of terror started, and the revolution started to eat its own children. So whenever someone made an objection, okay, the guillotine was there, and many people lost their lives during this period in 1792, 1795. And well, at first, the French Revolution brought high hopes for even all of the romantics, English romantics, the German romantics, other writers in France. But this reign of terror showed the dark aspect, the dark side of the revolution, and the people lost some of their hopes. And later on, we know that Napoleon came to the scene, and he called himself the Emperor of France. So the French uh, mm, did everything to make the government of the king constitutional, or then they put the king aside to have a democracy. But all of a sudden, the kingdom turned into an empire. So not that much of a change. And finally, Europe was torn apart by war, and everything was in a state of turbulence because of the revolution of 1789 in France. And of course, some revolutionary ideas already were exported to Europe from the United States. So, because the English people, as the neighbor of the French people, felt the threat of the revolution, they wanted to just stop any importation of revolutionary ideologies from either France or the United States, and they started to repress the thoughts, the ideas, the voices of many of the English people, because they knew that what had happened in America and what had happened in France can easily happen in England. So the English government started to spy on, even on poets. For example, there was a spy who is famous. It's a famous story that kind of checked Wordsworth and Coleridge, because he, or the English government, thought that they mean something. They want to start a revolution. So there was a kind of paranoid state of checking everyone, checking everything. The Licensing Act was working, and no writer, no playwright could actually perform his drama on the stage without the permission of the Lord Chancellor. And many other cases shows that the English government has felt the threat of a third revolution now in England. And of course, in between all these changes and all these threats, there were some English people, some English writers who brought forth the revolutionary ideas. Three of such radical social thinkers are introduced here. The first one is Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft is famous for her book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which justifies the equal rights of women, and she's considered to be the first feminist of history. But Mary Wollstonecraft, as a child of enlightenment, had also rationalized and justified the equality for all members of the human society, and therefore, in this way, she justified the French Revolution and her book published in 1790. The other figure is Thomas Paine. Tom Paine or Thomas Paine, at first, he was a journalist. At first, he wrote in some English magazines, but because he thought that maybe he's not that much safe in England, he migrated to the United States and he became one of the forefathers or one of the people who implemented the revolutionary ideas into the minds of the Americans, and therefore the American Revolution and War for Independence happened under the maybe ideas of a figure like Thomas Paine. In his Rights of Man, Thomas Paine advocated for England a democratic republic. So he had such thoughts for England, but when these ideas were thwarted by the English government, he uh, brought them forth into the United States and kind of implanted them uh, sorry, implanted them in a successful manner in the United States. And the third figure is William Godwin. William Godwin is the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, and he has written the famous inquiry concerning political justice, which of course but was again a justification of the equal rights of the people, and he thought that maybe the government should wither away. It was very idealistic anyway, but ideas of William Godwin had some advocates among the English Romantic poets. For example, Percy Shelley attended his speeches, and during those actually listening to William Godwin's speeches, he also was introduced to Mary, his daughter Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and then what ensued. And one trivia here: Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin were both the children of enlightenment, the children of the age of rationality, and their daughter Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley has written one of the most irrational stories of the English literature, which is Frankenstein. And this ironical fact just revolves around here in the Romantic period. And here we can see read something by Thomas Paine: "My country is the world, and my religion is to be good." These idealistic views had no place at the England of that time, and therefore he kind of exported them to the United States. And about the economic context at the time, the dominant philosophy was the philosophy of laissez-faire. And laissez-faire means let alone. So, what does it mean? It meant at the time that you can pursue your own interest without considering other people, and it is one early version of capitalism, of course. So it's set out in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and in that book he had emphasized that there is a group in the market who controls everything. And, if you're familiar with the notion of capitalism, we can see that the notion of invisible hand, for example, by Adam Smith, meaningful at the time, especially at the Regency period. Such theoretical theories of economy actually were followed, holds that the general welfare can be ensured only by the free operation of economic laws, and therefore the government should maintain a policy of strict non-interference and leave people to pursue unfettered their private interest. And in this way, the poor get poorer and the rich get even richer. Especially this theory was followed at the Regency period. And what is Regency period? From 1811 to 1820, 20, England was in a Regency period. King George III was not in a good health condition, so they considered him unable to follow the responsibilities of a king. His son, and the one who was supposed to be the king later after his death, was now in charge. He was called the Prince Regent, And in this Regency period, we see the flourishing of the both for the bourgeois class or the middle classes or the upper middle classes. The best literary representative of this financial philosophy maybe are the novels written by Jane Austen, exactly this class that we see in Jane Austen's novels, such as Pride and Prejudice, gain their wealth in such ways, such financial systems. So that prosperity experienced and represented in those novels is one of the results of this economic viewpoint. And it is famously said as the slogan of such a philosophy that the only fair is laissez-faire. Whether it is really fair or not, let it alone to the economists and the ones who are expert in this field. We are now in the realm of literature and into an introduction into the socio-historical and economic context of the Romantic period. But now let's move to the spirit of the age. What was dominant in the age? The term spirit of the age is used in Romanticism. In previous periods, we could refer to something as the common denominator. We could say that, for example, in neoclassical era, there were a series of rules to which the authors adhered. But in Romanticism, we cannot easily find the rules of literature or the definitions were not exactly identical. So, generally speaking, we can say that the Romantics shared a lot, even at the time they did not know themselves as Romantics. If you told Byron that you and William Wordsworth are going to be called with the same title, Lord Byron would freak out. But anyway, it happened in the Victorian era. They were called the Romantics. There are different reasons that this period is called the Romantic, and there are various ideas about it. But the most dominant one is that the period is called Romantic because some of the themes and ideas of the medieval period and medieval romances were revived by the Romantics, and that medieval revival had happened, and that medieval revival was also related to the themes of the romances. Therefore, it is called romantic. So when we call this period the romantic period, it doesn't mean that these poets have written love poems. To the contrary of this way of thinking, the romantics had changed the notion of romantic love forever. By the way, this name is now considered to be the name of this period, although M.H. Abrams emphasizes that the Romantic period is so diverse that we cannot just use one term for it, because we don't have any better terms, we call this period Romantic. But he just mentions that we should keep in mind that we don't have one singular form of Romanticism, and instead we have Romanticisms, which emphasizes the minute and sometimes big differences between the Romanticism of England and France, for example, or French Romanticism and German Romanticism, and also the differences between each romantic figure in a nation had to be acknowledged. For example, Byron and Shelley were similar but also very different. The first generation of the Romantics, including Blake, Southey, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, were totally different in some of their ideas from the younger generation of the Romantics, Byron, Shelley, John Keats. So, in general, we cannot say that romanticism have some rules, or we cannot just name the characteristics of the romantic period, but we can say that there was a spirit of the age. So there was something in the air that the writers had kind of experienced, the experience of revolution, rebelliousness, experimentation, and many others, but we cannot say just that the romantics are like that. There are, to use Wittgenstein's terms, there are some family resemblances between these poets, or writers, but they are not identical in the techniques or characteristics of their productions. Sometimes the poets of these groups, if we can just turn back, are called by separate schools, and sometimes these schools were chosen maliciously. They had names which, ironically, though depicted the group, but there was an insult in that. There was a kind of hidden insult in the naming. The first group are the Lake School of the Poets. The name doesn't seem to be that much negative, but the people who were called the Lake School of the Poets were always marked for being rustic and rural. So they're considered to be isolated figures who cannot know about the complexities of the city life, or who were isolated from all that industrialization. This school includes William Wordsworth, and they were living in the lake part of England. It was a district called Lake, and their houses was in there, and they were living as neighbors. So they are called as a bundle the Lake School. The other one is Samuel Taylor Coleridge. William Wordsworth was originally from this part of England, but Samuel Taylor Coleridge was actually brought up in London, but he believed that his children deserve a better kind of life, so he traveled to the Lake District, and also their friend and ally Robert Southey. And here you can see a picture of this Lake District in the lake. Even today, the nature is very beautiful in this part of the world. The other group are called the Cockney School. Again, it may seem natural to call a group of people Cockney, but at the time, at least at the time, it was not. They were mocking the accent and the actually poverty of the writers included in the school. Uh, the people who were involved were Leigh Hunt, the painter, dramatist, and poet; William Hazlitt, who was one of the figures who produced a new genre called familiar essay, together with Charles Lamb and Thomas De Quincey. And also we have John Keats, the most famous among these people. And Keats was under constant attack by the reviews and his other co-poets like Lord Byron, because both of his poverty. Byron was a snob anyway, because of his poverty and his accent. If you're interested at this part of London, the people speak Cockney, and one of the most well-known characteristics of the Cockney school is not pronouncing the H at the beginning of the words, like hopefully is pronounced hopefully. And if you're interested in a performance version of this, you can watch the movie I forgot the name of the movie. It's about a lady whose accent is Cockney. The movie is based, My Fair Lady. Her accent is based on this Cockney school, and the whole movie is based on the play written by George Bernard Shaw Pygmalion. Anyway, there is a linguist guy. The linguist guy wants to teach this lady to pronounce the words, the H, for example, at the beginning of the words. If you're interested, you can just watch that movie. And finally, we have the Satanic school. By satanic, we don't mean that these poets were the worshippers of Satan. No. Actually, for this group of poets, the character of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost was very inspiring. So they produced characters and heroes in their works which share some of the characteristics of Milton's Satan, for example, his rebelliousness, or his gloomy, dark aspects, or his non-repentance. Lord Byron and Percy Shelley are considered to be the members of the Satanic school, and because of this, they were also under malicious attacks by their reviewers and critics. Also, based on these categorizations, groupings, and classifications, we can guess that the Romantics did not shape a consistent and coherent group of the writers and poets, but anyway, they shared that kind of intellectual and imaginative climate, which is called the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the age. For example, we say that they didn't share that much, but we can say that they shared, all of them shared experimental boldness. So they experimented with different forms of language, with different genres, with different stanzaic structures. As an example, we can say that Percy Shelley wrote his Ode to the Westwind and Terza Rima, which was used by Dante in his Commedia, or Lord Byron experienced with Ataba Rima and Donjon, or with Spenserian stanza and his long poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. So they experimented with lyrical genre. They also changed the notions associated with these terminology. For example, ballads were not supposed to be personal, but romantics wrote personal ballads, or odes were supposed to praise a person most of the times or an occasion, but romantics wrote odes to abstractions, such as Ode to Intellectual Beauty, written by Shelley, or Ode to Autumn Duty by William Wordsworth, or Ode on Indolence by John Keats, or To Autumn. So they experimented with different genres, and they kind of personalized these genres in order that they could express their feelings or the state of the mind in their poems. We can say that generally the movement from Romanticism, from neoclassical literature to Romantic literature, is a movement from mimetic theory to the kind of expressive theory of the Romantics, mimetic or imitating the past or holding up a mirror to nature, is now changed into Romanticism, in which the poet even invites the audience to identify the persona of the poem with the character, with the personality of the poet. And we know that the Romantics didn't share that much, but they shared their definition of kind of poetry, or they're putting the basis of poetry on the notion of creative imagination. Although each one of them had a different understanding and conception of the term imagination, but all of them thought that literature is based on the imagination and based on the mental processes happening in the mind of the poet. So we experience a shift from the external to the internal, and there is an emphasis on the individual consciousness and the psyche of the individual poet. Maybe for the first time in literature, the writers dare to talk about themselves, and that was considered as a high type of literary production. One reason of this change from external to internal, or from objective to subjective, was the defeat or the thwarting of the high hopes associated with the French Revolution. At first, French Revolution was the messenger of hope, of change, but after that reign of terror, and then the wars happening as a result of the French Revolution, the Romantics were no more hopeful in social change. So they tried to change everything in the arena, in the field of mind, in the field of literature and imagination. So this movement towards the internal, or that inward aspect of the poet, has somehow a political reason, and that actually actually transporting their ideas from the social field to the imaginative or personal private part as one of the results of that. Of course, there are various reasons, but this is also considered to be a prominent one. And finally, I want to talk about this painting, which is considered as one of the symbols or icons of Romanticism. It has different titles, but it is also called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which is by the German Romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich. In this painting, we see some aspects of Romanticism, the first one of which can be the sublime, or the sublimity of nature. For the Romantics, the notion of sublime is defined as something which is at the same time full of awe, full of wonder, and we are amazed at watching it. But at the same time that we are admiring it and we are amazed, we are also threatened by it. We feel the danger, we feel the imminence of it. We see powerless, and we see ourselves powerless in front of this greatness of nature. So this painting is sometimes considered as the representative of the romantic sublime, but also we have the figure of a personality, a lonely personality here, and they say that the romantic figure is a lonely figure, like when William Wordsworth says that as I wandered lonely as a cloud, that the poet considers himself as dissociated from the society. He feels displaced sometimes, and that's why he doesn't look at us. He's looking at nature rather than looking at us. And this shows the prominence of nature and the prominence of the kind of perception of nature over the social relations of the romantic artist. And this close contact is also and there. But as we can see again, nature is greater, is bigger than the aspect of the human being. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you later explaining different other parts of romanticism and romantic philosophy of writing a poem.